Hi everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of the Human Factor Security Podcast. I am delighted to welcome this episode's guest, who is a friend and a mentor to me, author, journalist, broadcaster, Nicholas Booth. Hi Nick.
Hi, how are you? I've got a thing here on my phone that says, I'm talking to you about everything.
Well, I couldn't narrow it down. This is the thing.
I feel like I should grow a beard and sort of, ask me anything, child, I will tell you about the future, but, there we go.
Well, this is what I mean. First of all, let's just introduce you to everyone who maybe doesn't know quite what you do. So could you just tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are to start this off, and then I'll go through.
Yeah, I'm, I used to be a newspaper journalist, but now I write books, scripts and different things, and I've written about anything that interests me, really. So the reason why you and I got talking is because my last book was about a famous forgery on the Bank of England, and obviously a forgery on the Bank of England has parallels with today, so that's that. I wrote a book about a spy. I've done a book about life on Mars. Basically, I'm just a jobbing hack writer. If somebody says, here's some money, go away and write something, I'll go and do it. So that's me.
But you pick really interesting topics and interesting characters.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, just before we get into your latest book, which is amazing, this is Life on Mars. Just to say, you say that you're a hack and you're a journalist for all those years, but you were the youngest person to work at NASA, the youngest English person.
Yeah, I've lived that down. I've tried. I kept that quiet for many years. I was a teenage space cadet. When I was a teenager, the whole business of exploring space was wow. That to me I thought was the greatest adventure. And by a series of almost very bizarre accidents, I wrote to NASA when I was 16. I'm not making this up. I mean, you've seen the pictures, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wrote to NASA and said, can I have a summer job? And the bizarre thing was they gave me one. Now, this was 1981, and I was a kid in a foreign country. And the person who arranged it was one of the most important people in my life, a guy called Al Hibbs, who was a NASA scientist who'd had a remarkable career himself. And he arranged for this kid from Cheshire to go to California, and I've never looked back, really. I mean, people say to me, you must have problems trying to discern with what's really happening and what you've imagined happened, because a lot of this is, I still pinch myself. I cannot believe that I was in the same room as all the great names, Carl Sagan, all the famous names.
Feynman as well.
Feynman, yeah, the Feynman stories. But they were involved with setting up Southern California Skeptics with James Randi, who we just learned.
Yeah, R.I.P.
And
yeah.
And they're all involved with that, and it was great because there's no way I could have got there as a student, and the same way there's no way I could have got into the Bank of England as a sort of economist. But as a journalist, have pen, will travel. That's basically what I did.
And that was the thing about Life on Mars, wasn't it? Is that this was starting from those early experiences and enthusiasm about space. You kind of collected stories and interviewed people and used that position as a journalist to compile what's become the book, which we're going to flash obviously pictures and everything. You used that to compile this book, didn't you, over time?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because when I started, when I was 17, I met all the great names and I would just sit and talk to them because I was fascinated. And as ridiculous as it seems, in 1981, Mars was a taboo for NASA. Literally, if you said, go, can we talk about Mars? People would go and close the door. I think what happened was because there had been the Viking missions in the 70s that cost a lot of money, and $2.5 billion, I think it was. So I don't know what that cost would be today.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't find life, and even worse, they couldn't confirm there was life, and they couldn't confirm that there wasn't life. So they were sort of wandering around in a kind of intellectual desert and not really wanting to talk about it. And NASA had other things to do, like the space shuttle. And throughout that time, then I went to college, then became a hack, and spoke to people because I knew them. And I think they knew that I knew a lot about the subject because as a teenager, I didn't get out much. I was too busy writing letters to NASA. And yeah, it genuinely was, And so that was it. So I collected everything and reported on it when I was in newspapers. And the big deal in my newspaper career was the night in August 1996 when NASA announced they'd discovered something in the meteorite. You remember that story? And that was quite extra. That was like everything you've ever read in a film, where I was supposed to be meeting somebody, completely forgot, and the phone rang, and I spoke to him and said, "Look, I'm going to be late. You're not going to believe this. It looks like NASA has discovered life on Mars." I mean, you'd pay money to say that, wouldn't you?
You would, and they'd more or less resigned that to, like, they'd forgotten about, like you say, after Viking.
Yeah,
and there are rocks and things. There are rocks on Earth with nothing in them, and so that they just focused on something else, right?
It was such a strange story because it was literally, it came completely out of left field. The thing that Viking didn't find on Mars was organics, which is, remember at chemistry at school, those long chains.
Yeah.
And you need those to make life. If you don't have organics, it's very difficult to make life. And Viking didn't find any. And about 10 years after that, they started to find, 15 years later, they found organics in meteorites. So Mars, when it formed, was being bombarded like the Earth, like the Moon, that's why the craters. All this stuff was flying off in every direction. And a piece of rock that was thrown off, wandering through space for thousands of years, crashed in Antarctica. And a group of scientists, because if you want to look for meteorites, fresh meteorites, you go to Antarctica, because out on the ice sheets, you can see them. And it's almost like, yeah, that's why they go there. So I forget the number, there's something like 2,000 now have been discovered in Antarctica. It's like a sort of conveyor belt with all the ice, because these things, seriously, they've landed and then they can say, oh, look, that, and they pick it up. So they found this particular meteorite, it was a piece of rock, they analysed it, and I always got the impression if you had a rock from Mars that you were going to put on the naughty chair, that would be it, because it was unlike any other, it was older. They knew of something odd about it. In the notes, which I've seen, the photograph, they put it in a canister in liquid nitrogen to keep them frozen. The person who wrote "Yowza, yowza, yowza," so they knew there was something unusual about it. And then about 5 years later, they discovered, if you remember those photographs, this thing that looked like a worm segment. And it was just such a strange story. And it was, there were rumours, the phone started ringing, there was the press conference the next day, and then, well, off it went. And it was, it was the greatest story I was reported on, and I was in a pretty good position to be able to talk to the people. And here we are 25 years later, and it's a bit like Jarndyce and Jarndyce in Dickens, the story. People say, well, we found this, and then, well, that can be explained by, and that's how it will go on. And I get the impression they'll still be doing that in another 50 years' time, because at the moment it's to do with the shape of crystals that they found called magnetite, which is, if microbes chew on pyrites and form these crystals. And in 1996, the purity that they saw in this meteorite of these crystals, the only way you could explain it was with biology. So that was, and that's still, there's a couple of people who are still saying Custer's last stand. This is another bit. And so what happens is now scientists go to conferences, and the two world experts on magnetite crystals, they lay into each other, and it's really, really esoteric, and nobody can really follow it if you're not a magnetite crystal expert. So I think that will count. I mean, you've been to technology conferences when people start having a go at each other. It's nothing compared to scientists when they're going on about other stuff like that. So it was that. So all these kind of stories of the fact that I spoke to a lot of people, they're in the book. And the good, well, I say the good thing. The nice thing is that a lot of the first generation of people who subsequently died, we've got interviews with them. So, I'd like to think that their words live on in the book, but I would say that anyway, wouldn't I?
Oh, well, no, I mean, what a brilliant story, and taking over so much amount of time of your whole career and using that access. I just think it was just wonderful.
Well, the weird thing is, because I was writing the book and I was working full-time job, and the section I worked for, which was the technology section, when I started off, it was 16 pages and there were two of us. And 3 years later, there were still two of us, and it was 36 pages. So it's a bit. So my day job was doing this, juggling. And in '99, when I was just about to finish the thing, the two NASA missions both crashed, and no great work of art is ever finished. It's abandoned, and I just thought, you know what? I'm just going to leave it. And then the summer of 2018, I was in my mum's loft, and these discs all fell. And I thought, oh, and I started looking at them. And this,
let me stop you in a minute, because I know that it's not a case they just fell. They actually fell on your head, didn't they?
They did. And I thought, as soon as this wound it literally went bang, like, what the hell is this?
But that's
and all
like
these discs.
a sign, Nick.
And it was the day when there was a scientific paper in Science that the Curiosity rover had finally found organics on Mars. There was a message from the god of war. He spake unto me. So then I left reporting 20 years ago. So I've been chatting to a couple of people, and one of them was a reporter in Canada, Elizabeth Howell, who is the original Energizer bunny of writing. I mean, since we finished Mars, she's written 2 more books. I've done a bit of shopping, a bit of gardening,
bit of mentoring.
Well, yeah, tormentoring. Yeah, no, she's. So we worked together, and that's the book basically. And even though and we had to get it finished for this summer, purely because there are 3 missions now en route that will arrive there next February. And after that, it's going to be very difficult to put all this into one book. So that's that book, really. But yeah,
well, it's an amazing story.
Adventure.
It is. And can I just say that as of this morning, I see that on Monday, so we're recording this on a Thursday, Monday, NASA has got an announcement about the moon. Did you see?
I saw that. I don't know what it is.
No, it's a vague announcement, isn't it?
It's one thing that NASA has got very good at in recent years is teasing the press, because now nobody... The Mars story was interesting because it leaked, and there were lots of different theories. My favourite was the expensive escort with the Clinton administration official in the Washington hotel heard him talking to the Clinton White House about this and phoned a tabloid. You can't keep anything... this is what always makes me laugh about conspiracy theories.
Yes.
So NASA, you can't keep anything secret. Just 6 weeks ago, the Venus story, the day the book arrived in the UK. So it is Search for Life on Mars, Life Found on Venus. So I spent all day writing Venus every time. No, I didn't. That was a leak, because you can't, nobody can hide anything. With this thing, by the time this goes out, we'll know what it is. It's basically a NASA observatory on the back of a 747 that has a telescope that they can point very accurately. They're above all the water vapor in the atmosphere. So it's probably, I would imagine it will be something to do with water or resources, because NASA is now pushing for the Artemis mission.
We'll have to get you on our Tinfoil Hat Club, which is our conspiracy club, and get you talking about the moon landings another time, Nick, because your view on that would just be hilarious, I would imagine.
I'd start talking and then it would be...
Oh no, it's just brilliant. I always think of Buzz Aldrin punching that guy that said that the landings were fake. Anyway, so right now I've got to move into the next thing, because you've just said Nick and I know each other for a few reasons. Well, 3 things actually. Twitter, and particularly pointing out stupid criminals, and just laughing so juvenile and childishly when there's a stupid criminal. That was cats, obviously.
Yeah, they'll appear in a moment, probably.
Yes, and we can't. Both of us are silly about cats. But the other thing is the last book that you wrote, which I will flash up. Pictures of. I also have my copy, my signed copy, because the Thieves of Threadneedle Street, for me to have come across this and to get to know you as a sort of modern day con artist, professionally as a social engineer, this is just one of my top 10 books about con artists. This is, Nick, like a romp through something that, I mean, first of all, I'll get you to just you say this much better than me. Just carry on,
and as you're talking, you'll see my head, getting bigger.
Oh
and
no,
bigger.
But this is. Why don't you explain much better? Outline the story, and then we'll go into some of the details.
Yeah, I can tell you how I came across the story, which is quite interesting again.
Okay.
The story is really about a famous, although the fame had waned. It's a famous forgery in Victorian England that involves the Bank of England. And there were 4 forgers, and they attempted daylight robbery using things called bills of exchange. Now, in Victorian London, they were the equivalent of credit cards. You they were like IOU notes, and people would pass them around as credit. And as long as everybody in the chain honest, truthful, there wouldn't be any problems. Well, they started forging these. And that's really the story. And why I thought it was interesting is because I happened to be in Los Angeles, international man of mystery that I am, in 2008, when the world's economies were collapsing. And on the radio was the stuff about Bernie Madoff. So there were, the Con King and all this sort of stuff. And I started thinking, I wonder when the first one happened, just out of curiosity. And when was the sort of stock market crash and all that? So I started looking into it. And to my amazement, it was 1873. And if you, in the book, but if you look at the Great Panic of 1873, the world's economies were overheating because people were over-investing money into stuff that wouldn't work. Railways, there was a sort of railway mania. And when anything like that happens, as sure as, day follows night, there's going to be con men. And that was basically what they did. They sounded plausible because they're American, they arrived in London. They wore hats, they looked like well-to-do and spent money well, which they got from forged documents. And it's the thing that we've talked about. If you look the part, the behaviour part, people will believe you. And in those days, people thought Americans, were rich.
Yeah.
So they played that. They would go to the Bank of England. People would bend over backwards to give them money, and that's it. So that's really the story. But as you know, it's a complicated story because there are four of them. They were chased all over the world, and as I say in the piece I did, it's like Ocean's 11 meets Sherlock Holmes, except in this case, it's a real detective, Willie Pinkerton.
See, this is the thing. This is the thing. Yeah. It's not just about the Thieves of Threadneedle Street and the Bidner brothers and everything. It's the fact that you've got, on the other side of things, you've got the original Pinkerton, as in Pinkerton's detective agency, you'll flash it up on here, pursuing them. And this isn't a time before technology, really, but they're being chased all over the world. So much of the book, and you said it yourself, and I just want to say, I hope you're proud of me of the amount of research I've done on this book. Nick says himself, a lot of the action on this book is taking place on what was then the new high-speed trains. It was sort of all in transit. They were moving all the time.
Yeah, it's what I think is interesting is if somebody did it today, they would be in a faceless building in a foreign country going click on a computer screen. It would be done. But in those days, you had to present yourself at the Bank of England. They then met the Rothschilds in Paris. They were at it all over the world, and they were chased. And then when one of them gets to New York, after it all fell apart because they'd left a date off one of these things, somebody thought, hold on, this must be forged, and they looked through. So it's a chase at the end. When he gets to New York, the New York police are in on it as well because there was bribery. So you never quite. What I loved about it was you never quite knew who to trust, and you know that they're con men and they're getting on with it, but everybody else they interact with, and then there's something like, I forget how many court trials. There's 38 trials, and one of the problems, as again we've talked about, if you're for an international fraudster, today it's going click, and with documents it's like doing that. There's nothing inherently dramatic about it. But I went to Bank of England, and in the basement there is the archive, and there's the actual transcript of the trial. There was a trial for 8 days, which one of the lawyers said was the most amazing trial ever in the annals of history. And the transcript was there. So I didn't have to invent any dialogue because it's all there. And even more interesting, on the 5th day, there was rumours they were going to be sprung because one of the brothers of these forgers came over, started paying jailers at Newgate and other places, and there were strong rumours that as they walked into court, there'd be guns pulled, and that at the last minute was stopped. So it's a heist with lots of interesting angles that go on. And I just thought, it's a good it's a yarn.
And it on lots of threads. I mean, they got out of so many, when I say prisons, more like holding cells locally in America, just by bribing guards or by using contacts that they had. They'd set it up. I mean, the thing that fascinated me about this, and the way that you write it, well, there's lots of things. I've got a big long list of things I want to talk to you about, but they played this long con. I mean, when you talk about those bonds, they had actually used, done lots of exchanges with actual money to give the credibility going forward, hadn't they? I mean, they'd really thought it through. From like small beginnings, this was the big one that they'd really planned and pushed out over time.
The one that they started with is something called long-term fraud or long-term fraud. It has different names, but it's basically where you open a shop, you get stuff on credit, you appear to be, you know, selling stuff, and then all of a sudden one day the shop stops and you disappear off with all the stock and go to another country and sell it. And people still do that. You know, you read in you know cases of people still do that. So that was how they started. They go to New York, which, excuse me, after the Civil War was, you know, there's lots of great stories about the villainy that was going on in New York. It was like a sort of magnet for anybody who, they were involved with a currency forger who maintained, because again, during the Civil War, he said, I'm doing my patriotic bit to create forged Confederacy dollars, which were different than, you know, the North's, and I'm doing that bit to try and subvert the, you know, the currency. Nonsense. They were just he was trying to use Confederate money to make a vast amount that they buy stuff and do. So they were involved in all this stuff, and then they got together to do this heist on the Bank of England. And what's interesting reading the documents is that several people at the time thought, we've not got to the bottom. There's more to this than meets the eye. And as you know, I haven't read the book. At the very end, I end it on quite an ambiguous note. Again, I won't spoil it, but somebody on their deathbed has a confession, and you think, who is this guy? How many other people were involved? So that's
so good.
And it's true. But the other thing is, it was the reason I did it was because the same thing was happening again. The world's economies had overheated, economies had collapsed, and you look at con men and you look at stuff, and it's the same pathology. If you're believable, if you can pull it off, if you've got the chutzpah to do it, if you can walk into the Bank of England, to the gold weighing room and present a document that somebody says, hold on, there's something, you got this from this place in Lisbon, that's a bit unusual. No, they let me, okay, so there you go. And you know, it's just a great story because of all these. And then, of course, there's also the love interest, which were the various women who they were tangled with, including a real innocent who was an 18-year-old English girl who one of the forgers got married. I mean, there's a stroke of genius. You know, spousal privilege. If she's put to the stand, she can't
say. No.
Yeah, and it's just, you know, it's just a great story, but it's got resonances with today, as well, you know.
Well, when you say that they did the same, sort of the format of the con was the same, the reason they were caught is still the same reason a lot of people are caught today, is that they were so successful that okay, there was a mistake on the last bond, but it was just that they just got over ambitious. They got cocky, didn't they? Really?
Yeah. If they'd have stopped, because it took something like 6 weeks for these bills of exchange, because the Bank of England acted as the basic bank stop. And what's interesting is in 1873, people had started to say, hold on a minute, you need to be careful with this. Again, when have we heard people pointing fingers at the Bank of England? And if they'd have stopped, I mean, they got away with what was then 100,000 quid, which in today's money is probably 3 to 5 million. It depends on how you calculate it. And they would have carried on for another 3 weeks, and they'd have got away with 1 million then, which would be what, 20, 30 million today. But as you say, there's an interesting psychology of con men that they get cocky, and they always will do something. And in the past, when they'd been caught, they managed to talk their way out of it. But in this case, it was fairly incontrovertible.
Was it the older brother? Was it George that said he always said his ability to think on his feet was his greatest asset?
Yeah.
And I think that was the thing. It's that they just kind of stopped really. They got comfortable, and that ability to think, I sort of left them.
Yeah. I always point this out to people that con men and fraudsters aren't like you and I, because they have a different, not a genetic makeup, but whereas you and I couldn't do, I mean, we might do it.
As a career?
As a career, maybe, yes, sorry. I didn't want to be so bold, really. But people, it's not like you. I mean, I couldn't do it but they can do it because they need that kind of confidence that they can get away with it. And I always do think it's, if they've looked over and seen the precipice, then they'll keep doing it. Because it's that they, if you want to make an expression, get off on.
It's what it is, I think, I can simulate those cons for a client or whatever to guard against them, but it's all the tiny little knives in the innocent people, all the little things, the smaller victims along the way, and the bigger victims. That's what I that's how I interpret what you mean. It's, we can simulate the con itself and how to do it and everything else, but what you've got to have to be able to do it is a disregard for all the tiny little personal tragedies that those kind of crimes cause along the way.
I mean, that's always the thing they always say. Fraud is a crime without any victims. There are victims,
but there are even little things, and just add up to misery.
I mean, it would be, in today's world, if you did that on a pension fund, then there's a lot of elderly people who won't have a pension. And so I do think. I mean, this was it's just a great story, and not all frauds are this sort of complicated and interweaved. And I think also what makes it work is you can understand it, because each of the steps that they did, they had to do in person. If it was a computer fraud, that would be very different, because
it's a distance.
It's gone.
And that's, I say that about social engineering. There's a distance. To be a really good in-person social engineer, you've got to work with people up front, and that means that, like they did, that there's a certain amount of, yes, it's confidence. Obviously, confidence trick con artists, but it's a certain amount of persona, really, and that's what, like, particularly the younger brother, was Austin, the younger brother. He was so dapper, and he can't. For me, it was the way, like you said, the way they got away with it was just living that pretext, living the role.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't that they weren't dapper, but he used it as a weapon.
Yeah, there were four of them. There were the two brothers, Austin and George Bidwell, and there was something like 12 years between them. And George was let out first from prison and said, it was all me, it wasn't my brother. Because it's actually, you can see, what I've done with the book is, a number of people have written about this famous crime, but they've not actually pushed it back in time so I found the first recorded con that they got up to, which was in 1864, which was 9 years before. Yeah. So they'd got practiced at it, and, they were obviously, as my mother would say of her generation, wrong-uns.
Yes. But George said that himself, didn't he? He said he believed that he'd gone to the devil. Like, they were superstitious. Con artists and stuff and are.
They are. And they play, it's playing the roulette wheel of fate. And they either, they were successful at one point, and then they were all banged up for many years. And three of them came out and never got up to mischief again. And then possibly the slipperiest of them, George MacDonald, he was still up to, what I do think is quite sad is he was somebody he was the one who walked into the Bank of England and was stopped and said, hold on about, this document was questioned, and he got away with it. By the time he was 65, he was doing mail fraud in San Francisco at the end of his life for something like, for a couple of cents here and a couple of cents there. And it's very sad when you, in the kind of being in the major league of crime, to end up your life doing that. But it was obviously that's what kept him going, I think.
I mean, the other thing about the book that we've just touched on, I'll just talk about it now before we move to another one, but I love the fact that you make Pinkerton front and center as well, and that it's almost, I almost feel like when I read it that you sort of invite it, they're hard to dislike, the gang, but then when you put Pinkerton, and just to say to everyone, obviously I'll flash up some details about Pinkertons now, but that's an incredible character, and Pinkerton's was incorporated into the modern day, it's Securitas now, isn't it? They're still going, that security company.
Well, every story you need, I've just done a thing about storytelling, and I've said what you need to get a great story isn't people with black hats and white hats, where it's obviously, black and white. You need a little bit of shade. And the Pinkertons were interesting because Alan Pinkerton, the father, was a Chartist. So that was the equivalent of being, a kind of fairly mouthy revolutionary in Scotland. and went to Chicago, and then set up this agency because one of his strokes of luck was meeting the legal counsel for the local railroad, who was Abraham Lincoln. So that was how he managed to get on. So he'd been a sort of radical in his youth, and then, you know, various people said, you know, he'd become a willing tool of the power elite. And the Pinkertons, as they always said, always got down. And Alan Pinkerton had two sons, Willie and Robert, who he was, you know, a son of a bitch to, and was always bitching and moaning at them about their expenses. Willie used to come to London quite a lot, and Paris with the Sûreté. And as you know, to mix with the villains, you have to drink with them. And in the reports...
Don't know what you mean, Nick.
No, I don't know.
No, yeah, go on.
And he had, you know, it was people are worried about Willie's drink problem. So, you know, so you've kind of got this investigator who is like all the best investigators, knows perfectly well who's doing this, but is trying to find the proof. And there's a great scene, which, again, the original letter is in the archive, where Pinkerton was in London. He was walking along the Strand, and he saw Austin Bidwell and another ne'er-do-well, and followed them into it and wondered what up to, and, you know, made a note of it. And when Austin Bidwell was told about this, when Cuba, because that's where they chased him to, all the colour drained from his face and said, "Why didn't you stop now? You know, I'd have paid you to not investigate this any further." So it's got all this great sort of, all these scenes that you can imagine in a film or something, which I just thought was really, you know, it was great because it's just...
And you said, I mean, well, Pinkerton said himself, and you said Pinkerton wasn't someone who was given to hyperbole, and he wasn't particularly, someone who was easily impressed. But Pinkerton's quote was, "This is the most remarkable story of daring, forgery, and fraud the world has ever known." That was Pinkerton that said that. So he was like sort of like this morbidly impressed.
What I've also done is the Pinkertons were very, very adept at PR. They had ghostwriters and Alan Pinkerton.
And that motto and the logo, Nick, the motto.
I know, the eye is very, very scary, isn't it? I'll send you the picture. But they always, but the original letters, because the Cuba bit I think is the best bit. So you've got the four villains.
Yeah.
One of them is caught in a bank in London, and he's playing the patsy and says nothing, and then they realise actually he was, because they trace one of the women who called him a different name. So it's like, hold on a minute, what's going on here? George MacDonald got to New York. There were lots of trials, and the police were he was going to be sprung by. George Bidwell was chased to Cross Island, and that's a great story because they kept missing him, and he goes to Scotland, and there's a 90-minute chase in Edinburgh where a detective chases. I mean, that would be a great scene in a film.
What a great
camera. And then Austin goes with his bride, and he leaves the country first and goes to Cuba, and they decide to stay in Cuba. Now, when he wrote his memoirs, he said he was there for about 6 weeks. He was actually there for a week. And there's this long and involved story that sounds great, people bursting into a room, pulling guns and all that. That didn't happen. They were in the room together, and the police walked in. And what I found, again, in the archive is the letters from his wife to her mother, because she was the archetypal mother-in-law from hell who didn't want, because they married because they needed the money, because her father had died. They were in penury, and so the mother kept pushing the daughter to meet all these rich Americans, and her dander was up and thought there was something not quite right, and they had to elope basically. And there's a great letter where they were going to get married at St. Martin's in the Field, and they're in a hansom carriage. And there's this fantastic description that says something like, and then the screaming mother-in-law appeared and grabbed her child, literally pulled her out as the... So they get to Cuba, and she said, because that's the other thing with conman, the people around them also, are the ones who I think always pay the ultimate price, because she genuinely believed he was a rich businessman, didn't know that half of all this, and believed him because she wanted to believe him. And what's greater, literally within about the space of a day, the letters to her mother, you were right, I was wrong, and that's a great thing, because nobody's ever seen those letters before, and I just thought, wow. And there's a tragedy which I won't mention, because you can read the book, I don't want to set up and tell you all the best bits, but there's a tragedy, as you know, about a few months later. And she was the one who, she ended the workhouse, and that's the kind of sadness of the story. The women were kind of rich men's playthings, for want of a better expression.
They were, and I mean, it's an amazing story. And I just want to say as well, just very quickly, that Pinkerton was, even in the 1850s, Pinkertons were hiding women and minorities. So there was tragedy on one side, but the hero really, I mean, that was unheard of at the time. So absolutely fabulous story, Nick. And obviously, I mean, for me, just one of my favourite things ever to read it. So highly, highly recommended. We'll put the links to it in the show notes. And I just feel like I can't believe, because I've got Nick, I'm sort of saying, right, we'll go. The other book that you've written that I love, and then I'm going to talk about still another just very quickly, but brings us to, when we're talking about con artists and we're talking about chasers, the other book that you've written that's going to be made into a film, as I understand it, you've said in some interviews it's going to be, is about Eddie Chapman. Do you want
I mean, sure. That was, again, from when I was a kid, you know, late night telly. I used to stay at my grandparents and they'd go to bed and I'd switch the telly on and I have very distinct memories of this really strange film which had all these actors in it who were in Bond films, including Gertrude Govan. And that was called Triple Cross, which was the Eddie Chapman. So it's not a very good film. It's a complete mystery to me why someone like Terence Young, whose previous film was Thunder, made this film that just didn't quite work. And after I'd left newspapers, I just thought, I want to do something different. I don't want to do all this technology stuff. I want to do something different. And all the MI5 files from the Second World War were being released into what was then the Public Record Office, now the National Archives. Mm-hmm. So I got hold of them and thought, wow. And I thought, I wonder if his widow's still alive. Because there were lots of interesting references to the girlfriend at the time. Mm. And there's a lot of stuff in, one of the things that you learn when you're reading archive stuff, particularly from law enforcement or security, any amount of rumour, innuendo and stuff will be in those files because they want to portray the person as the worst. Yeah. So in these files, there are references to Eddie, who was basically just a ne'er-do-well from Geordieland, from Newcastle, and that he passed VD on to various women. And I contact his widow, so I'm going to meet his widow, and I'm thinking on the train there, how do I raise the topic with a 90-year-old widow about this? And I walk in, and she said, the first thing she said to me was, I've seen those MI5 files. There's absolutely disgusting stuff, and none of that happened. And if that was the case, I would have known about it.
Oh my God. And you're like, so of course, that's what I thought.
Yeah, so the story was, so Eddie was, he always reminded me of a couple of kids I knew at school who you either knew would end up in prison or be CEOs of all, do you know what I mean? Yeah. There was that kind of strange balance of not genius, but you knew that they were fairly wayward. And that was what Eddie was. And he got involved with ne'er-do-wells in pre-war London.
He was a social engineer, Nick. The more I look at that, I think, so obviously he gets involved with them safe cracking and everything.
Yeah, but that was the interesting thing because he liked to portray himself as the Mr. I was the, part of the gang. Now his widow said, if he got locked out, he couldn't get in again. So there was I suspect there was a certain amount of mythology that he made about himself.
The gang was called the Jelly Gang.
The Jelly Gang, because they nicked gelignite from places in Wales. And he was another one, exactly like the Bidwells. He was on the run. They got arrested. There was a trial in Scotland, and he said, well, I promised to be, I know I've done this thing, and they let him out. And he carried on another 6 jobs, which I think is just fantastic.
It's just
the reason why it gets really... Yeah, but he had the charm to be able to do that. And he was on the run, and he said to Betty, that was his widow, or his then girlfriend, let's go to Jersey on holiday. And it was the middle of March. And she said it just rained the whole time. So she wasn't exactly full of the joys of the spring. And they're on holiday in Jersey, and they're having lunch. And he looked up and said, oh, and jumped through a window, and she didn't see him for another 7 years.
Do you know what that reminds me of, that scene of what he did? It reminds me of the Thieves of Threadneedle as well, because the criminals that you look at, or the people that you follow, there's this huge sense of theatre. You probably didn't have to jump through a window.
No, he didn't. He could have just walked,
He could have run away.
But he went, and then he's chased across a beach, which I've read all the files, and that ended up like, like in Laurel and Hardy when there's a punch-up and there's two people in the car. And it was like that, because he pointed, that's the one you want, and the police jumped somebody else, and it was fantastic. So he's in jail. Jersey's invaded by the Germans. It's the only, so it's a part of the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Channel Islands, so that's quite interesting. He then got taken to a jail in Paris, and then they got up to mischief there. And then he said to the German intelligence people, ich bin ein Weber, I'm a safe breaker. So they trained him as a saboteur, and they parachuted back into Britain and went back again. And he's the only double agent, I think, who was parachuted twice. And he got away with absolute murder. When they were they trained him in a villa in Nantes in France. And he one day decided, just because he was bored, he put all the clocks for 4 hours. So the alarms went off at 3 a.m. Another thing he did, which is, I think it's in the files, but Betty told me that he did, that one day they're all, they're in Nazi uniforms, and there's a picture of Hitler, and he went, like that, and all the colour drained from their faces. When he got to Britain, he was parachuted in, and they took him to the War Office, and there's 2 guards, and he's with his MI5 minders, and he walks in and stopped and went, "Sieg Heil!" So he just...
Yeah, because he ended up being... Ronnie Reid was his case officer in the end.
That's right.
Now, those of you who don't know Ronnie Reid, I'll put one thing up, but then it's up to you to open why that's such a huge big deal.
Yeah.
And was his case officer as a double agent? Oh, my God.
Yeah, and there's all this stuff... Yeah. And it's just a great story, because what was interesting is the fact that when he came back the second time, the Germans thought, we think he might have been turned by the British Secret Service, and the British Secret Service never quite thought, but what they had, the advantage was the German enigma had been broken. They knew there was this character, and they'd followed his career, but they didn't know who he was. They knew he was called Fritzchen, which was Little Fritz. And it's just a great story, and he became one of the agents that was involved with the V1 bombs, where they were fired at London, and he was involved in. They couldn't alter a point where the bombings, where the V1s had landed, but he could alter the time. So they would change because literally the V1 was the world's first cruise missile with a counter on the back. And the greater the number of counts would tell you where it would land. So they'd just take off more counts. So by the end of that campaign, they were landing more in Kent, because there were a couple of other people who were radioing reports to say the places where they'd landed and the timings, which was the difference. And then after the war, he then gets up to even more mischief, which I actually think, because the stuff about the wartime stuff had been in the films, but his stuff after the war, so the film, I Triple Cross, he was made in France, and he couldn't be on set because no matter of the French authorities wanted him for involved with the kidnapping of a sultan from Morocco. So he was still up to no.
I saw that he couldn't go. He failed to contribute to the film because he wasn't allowed into France, wanted for his part and the alleged part to kidnap the Sultan of Morocco.
Yeah.
What a character there! Oh my God!
And it's like there's the great thing for me is trying to, I'm interested in the kind of stories and telling the stories about these kind of people. They're just, they're just great.
It is.
Not many of these people come across. And at this point, he said, swiftly moving on, my next book is a thriller, but I can come back and tell you all about that. Yeah.
Oh, Nick, so this has just been amazing. So we'll put where we can find those. We'll put links to everything in the show notes. Yeah. We would love to have you back on for 2 things. Certainly always to talk about any future projects or work.
Sure, absolutely.
But those conspiracy theories would be great for Tinfoil Hat Club. It really would.
Yeah, I know I won't, I walked on the dark side with a little bit but no, I'm quite happy to. And again, to me, what's interesting is, as you know, to try and persuade people about the dangers of fraud, it's very, very difficult because, but when you've got stories about people who did it to such an extent, you can get away with doing that, and that's what this is. That's why I did it, because I like writing, complicated stories.
Well, I personally absolutely love all of them. Thank you for bringing them to life in such a brilliant way. We'll definitely have you back on the show, and we'll put you can follow Nick on Twitter, especially if you want to see lots of stupid criminals and us having a laugh. But for now,
on Twitter I do Master Criminal of the Day, because, as you know, some of them are just, you read this stuff and you think, how did anybody think they could get away with this? And that's the other thing we should say about a lot of con men. The line between people who can get away with it and those who don't, it's a very fine balance. And you read these stories about people and it's open-mouthed of the kind of levels of stupidity. But the balance between stupidity and genius is very, very narrow.
Well, listen, Nick, thanks so much for being on the show, and we'll talk to you again soon.
My pleasure.